Now, our top story today. Government ministers are meeting to consider measures into clearing the names of hundreds of sub-postmasters who were convicted in the Post Office Horizon scandal.
The Post Office is now being investigated by the police over potential fraud offences arising from its prosecution of staff. And more than 1 million people have signed a petition calling for former CEO Paula Vennells to be stripped of her CBE.
We are joined by talkTV's chief political commentator Peter Cardwell and also Nick Wallace, the author of The Great Post Office Scandal. Thank you both very much for your time. Peter, we'll just start with you briefly. Ministers having this meeting today, in essence, what is that about? What could they change which would have an impact on those wrongly convicted sub-postmasters?
Well, Rosie, in theory...
Roly?
Sorry. That worked well, didn't it?
Brilliant.
Rosie, in theory, what they could decide is to put in a legal mechanism to overturn all these convictions and give people compensation immediately. The fact is that the system at the moment, which is arbitrated actually by the Post Office itself, is to look into compensation claims individually. That's taking far too long. These people have been waiting literally over a decade to try to get justice here. So the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalker, and the Post Office Minister, Kevin Hollingreck, are today going to try to find some way forward in this. Now, Rishi Sunak yesterday was a little bit equivocal with this. He said we're trying to find some sort of solution.
Wrong.
Yes, he did. He said this all happened in the 90s. It didn't. It happened from 1999 onwards, mostly in the 2000s. And there's pressure too on Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Can you just explain for people, because we're trying to get his old boss Vince Cable on the show in the next 2 hours. The reason there's pressure on Ed Davey this morning is because...
Well, because he was the Post Office Minister in between 2010 and 2012 and was asked by Alan Bates, who's the key character in all of this, the main campaigner. Mr. Bates versus the Post Office was the name of the ITV drama, which means that everybody now finally is talking about this, despite the fact the story's been around for a long time. But Ed Davey was the Post Office Minister. He was asked for a meeting by Alan Bates. He said he didn't think a meeting would serve any purpose. Now, last week on Wednesday, he spoke to our colleagues over on Times Radio about this, and Mr. Davey himself said that he was very badly misled by people in the Post Office. So he's trying to shift some of the blame. Let's have a look at what he had to say.
My heart goes out to all the sub-postmasters. This is a national scandal, and it's really hurt the lives of many sub-postmasters. And I think what we've seen on the TV, I haven't had a chance to watch it myself, but I've seen all the reports, and it is truly awful. You're right. I was postmaster, the minister for post offices for a short time, and I regret not doing more. I feel, to be honest with you, Matt, I was deeply misled.
A short time, 2 years, Sir Ed Davey. You spent your entire career calling for resignations from not only the government, but also the front bench, the opposition front bench. Maybe the Liberal Democrats need to stick their head above the parapet. Nick Wallace, by the way, I know very well. You consulted on the ITV show. We did a documentary a year ago. From my point of view, Nick, thank God at last, because of this programme, people in this country are understanding what an absolute travesty of justice this is.
Yeah, and I think as well as Ed Davey having questions to answer, there is also his successor, Joe Swinson, who was the Postal Affairs Minister, another Liberal Democrat, under Vince Cable in the Business Department as the cover-up was enacted. The independent investigators went into the Post Office and started uncovering or opening up this can of worms, and they were sacked on Jo Swinson's watch. She has never given an interview about this. I appreciate Ed Davey, as leader of Liberal Democrats, has a huge number of questions to answer, but there are huge numbers of people with culpability in all this, and very few have said anything significant publicly. There are also the unaccountable bureaucrats, the civil servants within the Business Department who will have been liaising with the Post Office on a regular basis. How much information they were given and how much they allowed to reach the ministers is also another very significant question.
Nick, can you explain to us, because it seems, from the public's perspective, this is such a gross, series of, in some cases, potentially criminal things that happened, which meant all these people were wrongly convicted. Why isn't it more straightforward to say, OK, we appreciate this was wrong, we're really sorry, you are owed compensation and we'll give it to you quickly? Why hasn't that happened?
Well, initially, after the postmasters, led by Alan Bates, won the High Court case in 2019, the government just wanted this to go away as quickly as possible, partly because civil servants within the government were complicit in this scandal. They allowed the Post Office to attritionally and aggressively litigate against the sub-postmasters. And when they lost, they then just hoped there would be no accountability. It has taken backbench MPs, campaigners and journalists years to force the government kicking and screaming into doing something about this. We now finally have a statutory public inquiry, which is starting to at least find some kind of accountability. But the two big questions about compensation and the quashing of convictions have yet to be properly resolved because they weren't implemented properly. The meeting today is very, very significant because that was prompted by a letter sent by the Horizon Compensation Advisory Board before Christmas, a single-page letter with a 90-page appendix explaining exactly why all the 900 plus post office convictions should be summarily dismissed, and explaining in some detail as to how the investigation and prosecution function at the post office was worse than fit for purpose. It was almost malevolently bad. And this is now what is being considered. There is a strange constitutional niggle in all of this, which is that the Court of Appeal has already refused to quash some convictions. And if government were to go back and say, no, these convictions must be quashed, that raises apparently very difficult questions between the separation of government and the judiciary. But there are many campaigners and many people who just believe in natural justice saying, well, that should not matter. You need to find a way around this. All these people who are prevented from coming forward to get compensation by the fact they have these convictions should have these convictions quashed because there were so many things wrong with the post office's investigation and prosecution function.
Nick, 700 postmasters, 93 only have been exonerated. Let's just put this into perspective for people tuning in who don't know about Horizon. Not only is the post office arbitrating the settlements, which is, in my mind, I mean, I was critical of the Met Police marking its own homework, but these people, let's take the human part of this story. People have died believing that or knowing that they haven't cleared their names. Barristers have told people, like our first guest, Tim, this morning, just accept your guilt, OK? That will be your plea bargain. They have been ostracised by their communities. Many will never recover. We listen to people in society nowadays who can't work because of the mental stress of whatever. These people's lives have been decimated by a system that has let them down. And the work that you've done and the work that this programme has done is fantastic because I genuinely believe this is one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in the United Kingdom's history, isn't it?
Well, there are huge failures across the board, not just the post office, not just the government, but as you rightly point out, the criminal justice system as well. Who is in charge of sorting out redress and accountability? It's the post office, it's the government, and it's the criminal justice system. You can understand why sub-postmasters are hopping mad that the post office and the government has control of the various compensation schemes which are being set up. And there are serious questions to answer about the way that innocent people were told that it's best for them to plead guilty because that will make it go away quicker. It didn't make it go away quicker. It ruined the rest of their lives. So there does need to be an examination of the way that our criminal justice system operates. And there have been several things set in motion. There's a review of the legal presumption that computer evidence is, if it seemed, there is a legal presumption. I mean, this is the insanity of the world that we live in. There is a legal presumption which the courts operate on, which says that if a computer appears to be working correctly, then it is. And that came from the 90s when people were trying to say that speed guns weren't working properly or breathalyzers weren't working properly. And it takes absolutely no account of the complex, sprawling ecosystems that modern IT environments are.
Do you know,
and yes,
Nick,
it was that which allowed the post office.
That Tim said earlier, he said actually he doesn't blame the fact that the computer system was faulty. He said, look, computer systems, in the way that you've just set out there, he said, well, actually, they are faulty. The problem is not his issue with the computer system, but clearly there's a legal issue there. He said it's the people and the mechanics around it where people said, no, that just can't be the case.
And the thing was, Rosie, this was, as Nick knows far better than I do, this was the biggest IT rollout, civilian IT rollout outside the military at that time and in the last number of years.
Can I ask a
there
question?
there were going to be flaws.
Nick, can I ask you and Peter a question? Because a good friend of mine, Holly, actually was in Northampton 3 weeks ago. I keep saying this and nobody's answered this. Goes into a post office for a nan, I think. They're still using the Horizon software. Is that right, with all its flaws and all the problems? Is that true?
Well, the Horizon software that the Post Office is using now is unrecognisable from the Horizon software that was rolled out in the 2000s, because every time there's a software patch, every time there's an update, the Horizon software changes. That's how complex this system is. And the High Court judge in 2019 ruled that the Horizon software between 2000 and 2010 was, quotes, not remotely reliable. And then the next iteration between 2010 and 2017 was not much more reliable. However, he did say that from 2017 onwards, it had got better. And there was another update, I think, a couple of years ago, which suggests that it is a lot more robust. But I hear all the time from people who are saying they are having inexplicable discrepancies with their IT. The thing that's changed, and Tim Brentnell is absolutely right about this, the thing that is changed is that the Post Office is now saying, OK, well, let's look into this IT problem to see what can be done to solve it, resolve it and mitigate it. Whereas before, they would just threaten sub-postmasters with menaces or take them through the criminal courts.
Nick, Paula Vennells is coming under significant scrutiny, and rightly so. Lots of calls for her to have her CBE taken away. Explain to us her role and what she said when she was questioned by MPs about the kind of role she had at the time in her defence of the Post Office.
She was the chief executive of the Post Office from 2012 until 2019. So she was in charge during the cover-up, and she was in charge when the Post Office signed off on the litigation against the sub-postmasters. Before that litigation concluded, she sailed out of the Post Office with a CBE under her belt into the warm embrace of the establishment. She became a chairman of an NHS trust, and she was also given a seat on the Cabinet Office Board. She was rewarded by the government for doing what she did to the sub-postmasters. She has never given a single interview to any journalist about the Horizon scandal. She did appear before a select committee in 2015, in which she said they have done investigations, but no miscarriages of justice have been surfaced. That was a palpably false statement, and it needs to be properly investigated. Did she know it was false, or was she given false information? Again, because she refuses to subject herself to proper scrutiny, we don't know. And yet she is expected to give evidence to the public inquiry, I think, after Easter. And we could see her in the witness box for a number of days.
Nick, for now, thank you. I mean, it's a baton that this man has taken up, Nick, and will continue, Peter, continue to move with. And we just hope, you know, whether it's an ITV programme, whether it's talking about it on news channels, it is quite possibly the biggest miscarriage of justice. Rob, my mate, just texted me. He laughed at the way I do this show. It's quite interesting. He said, if they'd actually robbed the Post Office with a gun and wearing a mask, the country we live in, they would have been dealt with fairer without as much ridicule as those poor people whose lives have been ruined. That is absolutely spot on, isn't it?
Rob's right.
That sums it up.
They trusted the system, Jeremy.
Yeah.
They said justice will prevail and that this will work. And, you know, if there's a problem, they'll sort it out.
Right. All yours, Rosie, right?
Peter, thank you so much.